Hi, David and the Miracle Team. Question for the podcast, if you have anything to say on it. I'm curious about affection and why it is so powerful. My current terrier/chihuahua is a rescue history of abuse. He seemed to want affection on his terms and would back/growl and nudge me to initiate, plus growl to end it. Due to aggression being shown, I've switched it around on him, so it's all on my terms now, and it's only once a day for a few minutes when he is in a calm mindset. This works for us, and we get on okay now. Things I've noticed, though. He cannot tolerate any affection from about 7 p.m. onwards. He seems to seek out affection, but at the same time, he can't handle it as his hackles go up. My boyfriend, who visits occasionally, has always given him way too much affection and baby talk, which used to end in aggression. Since having a chat, he has taken it down a notch, but now when my dog even hears his car, he goes into this insane frenzy of excitement, panting, barking, and trying to run out the door to get to him. My boyfriend doesn't give food or walk my dog, just fusses over him. To get to the question, how can affection alone have this extreme effect on a dog? What does affection even mean to a dog? Why is it such a valued resource and almost a drug to some dogs? Any thoughts, insights, or stories on the subject? Thank you and love the podcast.
All right. So let me move this over because I'm going to need to reference it.
Yeah.
Periodically.
It's a long one, yeah.
Obviously. Okay, so this is a very interesting question because obviously there's multiple questions that we'll get to throughout it, but I don't think it's necessarily what they think, right? So the commonality of this is why is the affection, why does that have such an extreme effect on the dog? And I think one important thing to realize is if I were to read between the lines of this, right, it is not the affection that is having an extreme effect on the dog, right? What's happening and what's causing such a extreme reaction out of the dog, if you will, is likely the lack of consequence for the miscellaneous things that the dog is doing when they get overstimulated by affection, right? So no different than, let's look at, food is a great one also that we could look at and see a lot of commonalities. So 5 minutes before I 5 minutes before I started this podcast, I just fed my dogs, put them in their kennels so that we can come up here and start it. And anybody that has a dog that's food driven, right, knows that when they go to feed their dog every day, the dog's excitement level goes to a borderline unmanageable place unless you've put in place proper structure and proper accountability for what the expectation of them is in that moment, right? So anything that the dog wants, right, they are going to try to get, and they're going to try to get that thing very, very, very intensely unless we teach them otherwise, right? That's normal. It's not an affection problem, right? So it's really the lack of accountability that it sounds like is what's ultimately confusing the dog. Now, affection is a goofy one because affection is coming directly from us, right? It's not like food where it's its own independent thing. The resource is us and how we're interacting with the dog in that moment. Now, getting to the next question here. What does affection even mean to a dog, right? Well, to every dog, it's a little bit different, right? Some dogs just really like being pet, and it's not any more, extraordinary than just they like being pet. Other dogs, it's deeper than that. It has nothing to do with the petting. What affection symbolizes is safety to the dog, right? So let's look at this dog. You mentioned, your boyfriend visits occasionally, obviously. He just kind of smothers the dog with affection, smothers the dog with baby talk. Based on everything you said at the beginning of the aggression issues you've had with the dog probably is very insecure, probably not super genetically sound, things like that. This dog is going to seek out what they determine is the safest thing for them when they start feeling uncomfortable. And safety is a resource that also we could sit down and talk about from the standpoint of that is like a drug to people also. Why would people cling to things that make them feel safe? right? Yeah. Why would dogs cling to something that makes them feel safe? Well, because if they're scared of everything else and this thing provides a sense of safety, that ultimately is going to have a very, very strong impact on them, obviously, right? Almost like a drug to some dogs. It says, why is it such a valued resource and almost a drug to some dogs? Obviously, same exact concept, right? If it's more than just being pet and it really is this sense of safety, obviously, if you have a fearful, insecure dog that doesn't feel they're getting adequate direction, they are going to cling to the thing that makes them feel the safest, right? So I don't think this is any deeper than that, right? Now, a lot of this from the standpoint of, I'm trying to figure out how to word all this, because it's another one of those ones that I feel like is simple, but like very nuanced and complex at the same time, right? Dogs like affection, right? Dogs like being pet. Dogs like getting treats. Dogs like getting food, right? Yep. And if we leave them to their own devices around those resources, they are going to get those things as much as they want whenever they want it, right? So that's why, and they don't have this ability to like self-regulate on those types of things, where like myself, like I really like food, but I understand, the implications of eating too much food or any of those types of things. So I could cognitively look at that thing and assess how much of it should I actually have, right? Yeah. Dogs don't really have the ability to do that, obviously. So it's our job to help navigate those resources and teach the dog to regulate in the presence of them, right? So like I used the feeding example. When I fed my dogs, like if those dogs had no training with as much food drive as they have, it would be uncontrollable. I would be getting the food bowl out of the cabinet, right? And I would be opening the bin, and they would be diving headfirst into the bin as I'm opening it, right? And they would be grabbing a hold of the food as I'm scooping it into the bowl and like all this kind of stuff. But because we have proper training on them, I could create an alternative expectation that helps me control that thing, right? Which is just waiting for it, right? I teach my dogs not to go for that food until I give them permission to go for it. And though that's not going to change their perception of the resource, of it being something that's highly, highly valuable to them, they will ultimately understand that because I'm in control of them in the presence of that resource, they have to keep themselves under control, and it won't hit a point of being super problematic, right? Yeah. Same deal would apply with, let's look at your boyfriend situation here, right? So boyfriend comes over. You said the dog goes absolutely insane. It's a frenzy of excitement, panting, barking, trying to run out the door to get to him, this, that, right? And you said doesn't give him food or walk the dog, just fusses over them, right? That's a resource. That's the equivalent of your boyfriend is the food, right? That you are about to feed your dog, obviously. But the issue is not that your boyfriend resembles a really high value resource. I want my dog to like the boyfriend, right? I want my dog to like my wife, my friends, stuff like that. Yeah. But you don't have any control over the dog in the presence of that resource. That competing motivator of him is way too strong that you don't have the ability to focus the dog in the presence of it. And some people will look at that from the standpoint of, well, okay, it's my boyfriend's fault. He needs to stop fussing over the dog. He needs to stop doing that. And though I'm a pretty firm believer that we want to manage arousal levels with things, and a part of that comes down to like, hey, can I control the other side a little bit? Regardless of what anybody else is doing, if I run into a situation where I have no control over my dog because my dog is too excited about that thing over there, that's a problem.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And that's something that I would look at addressing, right? You kind of mentioned, so to that point, like when he comes over, like, do we have the ability to make the dog hold a bed stay for 30 minutes while he comes over, right? Do we have a way to hold the dog firmly accountable for not doing that thing, right? Yeah. Which is where I got to like the initial question, how could affection alone have this extreme effect on the dog, is because of the lack of consequence, right? The presence of something you really want to get to with no rules, no boundaries, no accountability creates chaos, right? If there weren't rules in the world that said I couldn't go and take whatever it was that I wanted, I would be going and buying the big screen TV and going and taking the PlayStation 5 and going to every store and buying whatever wardrobe I wanted. And I say buying, just taking, right? I would just be taking all of those things mindlessly, and it'd be like, oh, I want the car next, and I want to go and get this next, and I want to go and get that next. But because there's rules that state I can't do that, and there's accountability for that, I can manage myself in the presence of it.
Yeah.
Even though those are all things that I would love to have, right? Drive down Lake Road, you see that $5 million house. It's like, I'm just going to go take it, right? I'm just going to go get it because there's no accountability for not doing it.
Yeah.
Right? It would create a frenzy of just like the options are endless at all times, right? So if that makes sense, right? The lack of accountability, that is the problem. Right? The lack of rules in the presence of resources, the lack of getting the dog to be able to practice discipline in the presence of resources is what manages and balance all of these things out, right?
Yeah.
I've said it a million times on this podcast before. My dog, Vinny, my Malinois, is obsessed with my wife, freakishly obsessed with my wife. Right? That's just it. Right? And that obsession, if there was no degree of accountability, not even just on her end, right? Yeah, if she's home alone with him, obviously it's up to her to create that accountability. But when I'm home with him in the presence of her, it's my job to make sure he could control himself in the presence of that high value resource. Right? So you've got to look at things from that light, right? The part about the affection leading to aggression, I would be very curious to know what that really looks like. You know, so the hackles up, right? The stuff like that. Like, again, using stories and examples, Vinny, right, is a quirky dog. He really likes being pet, but sometimes if I get him too frenzied and pet him and stuff like that, it'll start turning into this like purr, growl, and then like sometimes he'll just get so overstimulated, he just kind of like will snap a little bit, right? It's like, whatever, that's him. Like, he's not doing anything necessarily wrong, but it's like that's where I know, like, all right, well, I've taken the arousal a little bit too high with him, right? Deli, my other dog, was a great example. She loves attention, but when she would get herself too overstimulated, would do a very similar thing, right? So I would pet her, and you knew this from when you first saw her, right? I would pet her, right? And she would get so tense because I liked it so much. And she's just trying to contain herself. And then when she hit a point where she couldn't contain it anymore, it was so funny. She would do this thing where it's like, she would just, she would like scream and just jump, right? And it's just from bottling up and containing all of that excitement, right? Yep. So I'm curious if this is a similar thing to that or not that you were seeing, right? Obviously, you mentioned affection always being on the dog's terms can create problems sometimes. Like, if the only time we're ever petting our dog is when the dog comes up to us and nudges us with their nose, and then we give them a little scratch, they are very quickly learning that they are in charge of things, right?
Yep.
So you've got to control the interactions a little bit, obviously. You got to put things a little bit more on your terms with that. But again, the accountability side of things is what's screwing things up in this situation. So I would be looking at right now, get your training to a much higher level. So when your boyfriend comes over, you can control that dog 10x better. And then as far as the aggression with petting and stuff, if you gave us more examples of that, I'd be able to look at that and help you understand how to work through it a little bit better.